Welcome to the Transport Seminar. Today, it's our pleasure to welcome Professor Ron Buliung from University of Toronto, and he is the graduate chair in the Geography Department at University of Toronto, St. George as well. Thanks, Ron, for coming.
Yes, wherever here is, somewhere in the ether. I want to just take a moment to also thank Ahmed for inviting me to give this presentation. And it's a wonderful opportunity to talk to people who are spread really across the globe about work that I'm deeply passionate about, largely from a personal perspective, but of course also from a scholarly perspective. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal experience that sort of led me to do research in this area. Just checking in, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, we're good? Okay. So one thing that I like to do, though, is I want to take a moment to offer our the land acknowledgement from University of Toronto. So I wish to acknowledge this land on which we are and where the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And it might seem kind of odd to start with the land acknowledgement, given what's happened with our institutions and COVID, but as the University of Toronto, as many of our universities have spread our work across different places, you know, I'm mindful of the fact that the infrastructure of the internet, my home, and other places where we work are all also resting on this land. So I have cut quite a bit of ground to cover today, and so forgive me if I accelerate through some things and speed up and slow down and so on and so forth, but that's just the way it's going to be. Sorry, I'm just bringing up my clock here. Okay. So I really kind of want to start a little bit with personal biography. And increasingly, I found that learning more about who the people are that we're reading is a really valuable exercise in understanding what motivates people to conduct the research that they happen to be doing, what shapes their thinking about particular questions they might have. And I'm sure that some of you, you know, I don't actually know who's in the room, but I'm sure some of you might be wondering, well, how did this guy, who, you know, may appear on screen to not have any visible type of disability, get involved or interested in disability studies? So I think it's important to start here, and I'm going to come back to biography later on. So we'll start with my family. So the little person you see there in the chair, that's my daughter, my youngest daughter, and she has she was born with a genetic neuromuscular disease called spinal muscular atrophy. She's type 2. There are 4 types. She requires a power wheelchair for independent mobility. And I like to show this picture because the picture that's on, I guess it's my left of her with the other girl, that's my eldest daughter, who's at Guelph now, studying biomedical science. I mean, all of the material objects that you see there are to support her in one day of a summer camp, one day of a summer day camp. So I feel like this picture really communicates something about the care work that's involved in facilitating or enabling quality of life in the context of a child with disability. And then on the right hand side, you can see a picture of Asha getting on a school bus. And you know, I used to do work on school travel more broadly, looking at children's independent mobility and active transportation. prior to Asha's arrival in my life, which was a transformative moment really for me personally, but also in terms of my research trajectory. And what's interesting is if you look at the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, children generally on average are achieving independence and traveling to school around 10 to 12 years of age. Asha was traveling basically independently to school at the age of 4. So when I think about disability, and I'm stealing this phrase from my colleague and friend Tanya Tichkowski, I think about limitations and possibilities. When people see Asha, they often see the chair, they see limitations, they see, in quotes, disability. What they don't see is a child who's traveling independently to school 8 years before the average case in the city of Toronto, right? So part of what I want to do today is sort of challenge maybe some of your conceptualizations of what disability is. I don't know like the background of all of the folks who are in the room. So like I was really trying to cast a wide net with this talk to maybe in some cases help point you towards different ways of thinking about disability to inform work that you might do, and in other cases to stimulate interest in thinking about doing existing work in a different sort of way. But before I start diving into disability rights, disability education, and transport, I want to talk a little bit about language. And I know this is something people struggle with. In fact, prior to this meeting, I was in a session on microaggression in the academic context. And a lot of that discussion was about microaggression and anti-Black racism. And a lot of that discussion was about language, the language that we use and how it impacts people. Yeah, words have power. We as human beings can hurt one another using the language that we use. There's no doubt. How do we deal with disability as a concept in the context of language and how we address one another? Well, really, there are kind of two thrusts. One is the identity first language, and the other is the person first language. I could spend 2 hours talking about this, right? What I want you to hear is that there is really no consensus. We have folks who really gravitate towards putting the person ahead of any sort of indication of impairment or clinical diagnosis. This is called person first language. And we have other folks who might come from an activist, radical disability scholarship, or everyday life context who put the impairment or diagnosis ahead of person because it is very much tied to, or they view that it's very much tied to their identity. So kind of, you know, so in a lot of my work, I use the person first approach, and I'll tell you why. The person first approach is also very much reflected in rights-based discourse on disability and access. Like if you look at the Ontario Human Rights Code, or the Charter, or the Canadian Human Rights Act, they're using person first language. So what do you do, right? This is complicated. There isn't consensus. Really in clinical practice or education, use person first until told otherwise. I mean, the basic principle I operate on is let your subject tell you how they want to be, how they identify, or how they identify themselves. You know, I was talking to my daughter yesterday. I said, Asha, how do you describe yourself? Do you think of your, you know, you think about disability, do you call yourself, do you think of yourself as a person with a disability or a disabled child? She's like, oh, I don't know. You know, like sometimes disabled child, sometimes person with disability. She's not really, at this point, she hasn't really thought this through in a high level abstract intellectual sense. But the most important thing is that I asked her the question in the first place, right? Also be aware if you're working with kids and children and families, that the language that they prefer may not accord with your language and beliefs. Rather than thinking of this as a debate that has a right or wrong answer, try to understand the conceptual political differences. And it's okay to be uncomfortable with it, you know, and try to work, you know, I think the most important thing is to think through the use of language and labels and what it means to yourself and what it means to the people around you. Okay, now the other thing that I want to say is some of the folks in the audience may be very interested in methodology, very interested in thinking about how we go about constructing knowledge. And so I'm gonna tell you right up front that this is a talk that suffers from or benefits from theoretical pluralism and ontological, epistemological, and methodological inconsistency. That is, I'm working through these issues myself. And so, you know, you might say, well, why is this guy starting by looking at data where people are being labeled as disabled? Isn't that inconsistent with what he just said about language? What I'm trying to do is to convey something about the prevalence of what some folks would call like sort of disability in the Canadian context, right? And in some cases, people are self-identifying as disabled, and then they're being counted in particular ways by institutions and government. At any rate, I'm interested primarily in children. So something like 3.7% of Canadian children 0 to 14 years report living with disability in 2006. Of course, people are becoming disabled through the life course just because of the aging process, right? But there are particular challenges in society that don't result from disability per se, but result from the experience that individuals who might be identified as disabled have in society or with society. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. But there are challenges related to educational attainment, employment. For example, if you look down here, 59% employment rate for persons with disabilities, 80% for persons without disability, right? If we look at education, a good thing to do since we are in a university setting. If we look at rates of bullying and exclusion, they're kind of similar proportionally to the broader population, but the difference is what somebody is being bullied about. So like 27% of high school, college, or university students are bullied about their disability. I'm going to get to the social model of disability, so forgive me for using language perhaps in a way that is not desirable at this point, but I just want to get through this material. 10% stop their education because of their disability. Like, as someone who is in an administrative position in the university, I think about this. It matters to me. It's like, okay, so we have a student who's a graduate student who has an impairment, who is disabled by something that's going on in our institutional context, and they leave our program. That's horrendous. That's not an outcome. That's not it should be thought of as a desirable outcome. And I don't think we're really focused enough on the possibility that this is happening. Not to mention getting there in the first place, right? One of the challenges, though, with this Canadian Human Rights Commission report is that it excludes people living in First Nation reserves as well as people living in collected dwellings. So, like, even in the context of looking at a social policy issue like this, there are still exclusions that occur. Longer time to complete education, some data indicating that adults were about half as likely to get their university level degree compared to adults without disability. So what's going on there? Where is the lack of support? Is it about infrastructure? Is it about social support? Is it about even just getting there? Is it about income? Probably about a lot of those things in combination. This might seem a little bit small, but I did want to talk about how expensive disability can be. So if you think back to the power chair that Asha was in, that chair costs about $27,000, right? That's basically a brand new, I think the first car I owned when I became a professor may have cost somewhere around that amount. There are government programs that provide financial assistance to help pay for this, but a lot of those are geared to income, which makes sense. But there are also real problems with those programs. So, for example, in Ontario, we have the assistive devices program, this amounts to like some people sitting around a table and deciding literally what will Ontario pay for and what will they not pay for. So as an example, if you're in a power chair, allowing the chair to elevate, to move up and down, so you can be at the same height as people around you, is an optional add-on. So they won't help cover that. Or recline, right? Even though someone who's so-called able-bodied can do all of that without without the mechanized support, the government is unwilling to match that in the disability context. Okay, so what is disability? So so we talked a little bit about the prevalence in Canada and some of the challenges. How do we go about conceptualizing disability? And you know what? There is a myriad of ways to do this. And this graphic kind of shows some of them. So we have the religious, moral, divine model. It doesn't matter. I happen to be a Protestant who grew up in the United Church of Canada. So when I talk about the religious divine model of disability, I'm gonna pick apart my own religion, recognizing that there are different interpretations of the text beyond literal interpretations. Here we have the World Health Organization International Classification of Function, which is a real like fascinating thing to wrap your head around, as sort of a taxonomic representation of bodies, activities, functions. Down here we have the social model, which I'll talk a little bit more about, the charity pity model. And here, you know, there's a whole discussion around neoliberalism and disability, which I find quite fascinating, sort of economic and market-based models. This is literally, and we'll come back to this later, this working wisdom, how workers with disabilities give companies an edge, is a headline from a paper, which you may, you know, the language that's used in these types of market-based, economic-based representations of disability is really interesting to reflect on and sort of unpack and think about who's gaining what in that context. Oh, that was a mistake. Hang on a second. Let me get back to my slides. Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to dive into some of these models very quickly and focus most of my discussion on the social model, because it really informs a lot of my thinking, a lot of the thinking globally on sort of disability scholarship. Some of you may be old enough to remember who this guy is. This is Jerry Lewis. He started the Muscular Dystrophy Association. They'd have a telethon each year. It's still ongoing. And one of the things that they like to do, and my family's actually benefited from resources from NDA and from Easter Seals and so on. But one of the things that happens with the tragedy charity model is that the bodies of disabled persons and their experiences are sometimes used to generate pity with a view to extracting capital from the viewing audience, right? So this is an early example. This is Ben Matlin. He wrote this book, Miracle Boy Grows Up. He was one of Jerry's kids. Ben actually has the same disease, neuromuscular disease, as my daughter. He went on to get an economics degree at Harvard and is a freelance writer. Look, he has spinal muscular atrophy. They dressed him up in these leg braces and said, if I grow up, I want to be a fireman. Right? I mean, this is just a painful poster to process. But what's interesting is if you actually go and look at what Ben says about this upon reflection, he says, my parents kind of believed in it. This was the only organization that existed that would serve them. First, I thought it was fun. I'm going to be famous. But after a short time, it got tiresome. The ad had me standing in leg braces and, you know, and so on. I was told I had a normal life expectancy at that point, and I did not want to be a fireman. So I was quite upset. I knew I couldn't be a fireman. That was absurd. It felt untrue, and I felt exploited. So this is, you know, I think about microaggression, reflecting on that in the context of our everyday life. I've actually had people come up to us and say things like, "At least she's pretty," in terms of my daughter, right? So um, outrageous and painful, and it's something that I sort of carry with me on a daily basis. Even every time I give this talk or something like it, and I use this quote, I feel it. So how do I reconcile the fact that I disagree with the pity charity model, yet I access funds from those organizations? Well, you got to do what you got to do. So I'm going to live with these models, but in a new way that might change them in the end, right? So I have some power in the context of having conversations with these organizations and so on. And this is something that I struggle through all the way along. Like I can't just be someone who says that, you know, I can say that disability is something that is produced by society, but I also have to focus on impairment. Impairment is not a bad word in the context of disability studies. Impairment refers to the bodily aspects of our conversation here, right? So the clinical diagnosis, what the body can or can't do, the pain that might be experienced by the individual. The impairment is the thing that the doctor deals with. Disability is the thing that society writ large needs to deal with, okay? I want to just talk briefly about the religious model. And, you know, if you go into, and like I said, I'm being picky about my own religion, right? And I'm not saying, like, there are many different variations on the theme. We have fundamentalist Christians, and we have people who are quite liberal and more flexible, like the United Church of Canada. I'm no longer a practicing member of my faith. But I find it fascinating to, you know, if I treat and think about the Bible as a religious, as a text, as a historical text, and look at representations of disability in Christianity, you know, you can find, you know, a lot of the time the miracles that Jesus performed were focused on folks that were the infirm, the disabled, the poor, and so on and so forth. So this is a painting that was created during the Italian Renaissance by a Venetian painter, Palma Giovanni, 1592. This is Christ healing the paralytic at Bethesda. There's another famous story about the blind man of Bethsaida, but I want to use this one. So if we look at the theological perspectives, there are three things that go on quite often in these biblical stories: conflating disability with sin. That is, like, somebody did something really bad in the family or the person, and as a result, this is punishment. The second theme is virtuous suffering. And the third theme is persons with disability as cases of charity. The other thing that comes up, though, is kind of a link between that occurred to me yesterday, was thinking about the medicalization of disability and the way in which disability is written about in the Bible, thinking about disability as something that needs to be cured, right? So really, it very much is a rests or sits as an individual problem in the context of the Bible. So, so Jesus says to the paralytic at Bethesda, "Do you want to be made well?" And the sick man answered him, and so on and so forth. So they use words like sickness, to be cured, to be well is to walk, right? Think about that. We have an entire literature focused on walkability. What does that actually mean in the context of disability? You know, my daughter, when she goes for a walk in her wheelchair, talks about walking. That's how she walks, right? So what she does challenges our typical idea of what it is to walk. But somehow the able body is the well body. The individual or medical model, and I'm going to come to the counterpoint to this. The individual and medical model, again, following off sort of Judeo-Christian tradition, locates disability within the body. So the two most common ways in which people generally see persons with disability or disability in general as the medical model or the individual model, and I kind of treat those as the same thing, and the charity model, in part because these are like charity and medicine. These are things that are held quite highly in our society. They're put in our faces all of the time, right? So in this context, the body is the problem. It is something to be fixed and cured. And I don't, well, I'll come back to this in a minute. So what's the problem with the medicalization of disability? Well, the simple answer is that disability is a social state. This is from some of Michael Oliver's work. It's not a medical condition. It's not something to be treated. Moving on then to the social model. So this is kind of where my thinking sits. I know my student kind of thinks, or my former student is more into critical ableism, but I still like the social model. I think it's a great entry point for helping people to understand this difference between clinical diagnoses, impairment, disease, and what disability actually is, right? So it's a problem in the world around us, not to acknowledge and prepare for and plan for and build for different ways of being in the universe, right? Different ways of moving, different ways of feeling, seeing, hearing, and so on and so forth. Where did the social model come from? And this is a terrific story, actually. It's Michael Oliver, who passed away in March of 2019. Basically, he's Britain's first professor of disability studies. He is the embodiment of the social model. If you look at his, again, coming back to biography, some of you will know Michael Oliver's work, but he basically established the discipline disability studies. Prior to Michael Oliver's work, there was a private union of the physically impaired against segregation who actually located their discourse about disability in the social model, or they wrote, when they were writing about disability, they were actually, they sort of predate his thinking about the social model, or their work informed his thinking about the social model. So we almost didn't have a Mike Oliver. I'll tell you, one thing is Michael Oliver was a three-limb, so they call it trialegic. So he had problems with, he couldn't walk and one of his arms didn't work very well. So, but this was the result of an acquired injury, right? So he often joked that he simply had been in the right place at the right time to find himself at the forefront of a movement. So much like, kind of, I'm not saying, who we are and what we experience shapes the way that we look at the world, right? So the presence of my daughter completely transformed the way that I look at the work that I do, what I want to do, when I want to do it, who I want to work with, what I want to advocate for in the academy, and so on, right? Similarly speaking, I mean, this experience that Michael Oliver had completely changed his life. And what happened was, following a period of convalescence and recovery, someone came and approached him about doing some work and doing English language training with young offenders at a like a prison complex or something. Turns out the person who'd been there previously had been in a wheelchair, and so they'd modified the space. This is in the 60s. They modified the space for a wheelchair user, so he was able to work there. Later, he would go on to try to take his first degree at a university in the UK, and left within days because there was a lack of accommodation, a lack of physical space. And thankfully, he was able to go to another place. He finished his degrees at Kent, where they dismantled these barriers, right? So had that not occurred, we wouldn't necessarily have his scholarship and his contributions, right? So when we're thinking about the accessibility of our buildings in the institutional context, think about Michael Oliver. Don't think about, oh, it's a drag, or it's costly, or it's going to be impossible. Think about the possibilities that inclusion brings, or what could be lost if we don't have inclusive learning spaces. I just brought up the UPIA's document fundamental principles of disability, it's important to note that the site is London. It's 1975. It predates Michael Oliver's first book by 8 years, and it is their view at that time that society which disables people. Disability is something imposed on top of our impairment. So it's really in the early 70s where we start to see this gravitation towards thinking about disability as something being outside of the body. And this is just the UK story, right? These stories were happening in the US, probably in Canada, although there's not as much of a sort of history there. I'm going to skip over the ICF because I want to focus most of my conversation on the social model. You know, and the other thing I'd point to is with economic and market-based models, you'll see these things in the newspaper all the time. We now have like an Accessible Canada Act, which has received royal assent, which basically says by 2040, everything's going to be accessible. There's a great thing in the disability rights world where like procrastination seems to be the overarching goal or practice. So in Ontario, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act 2025 is like the end date on that. Accessible Canada Act 2040. We're way behind in doing anything that gets us anywhere close to the stated goals and objectives of these acts. But a lot of the language that you'll see in newspapers about disability and society and the economy is about what disabled bodies can bring to a company. One of these articles talks about hiring disabled hiring disabled people because, oh yeah, it's this one, because businesses for a business while helping to avoid potentially harmful events such as lawsuits. Like, I mean, it's just so, I don't know. I don't really know how to articulate my frustration with this, but it seems to be a very one-sided argument. Now, I've got a lengthy module on disability rights, and I'm not going to go through it in detail here. I want to get into the work that we've been doing. But what I want to say is that, you know, really from the following the, so there's a North American story, there's a story in the UK. My conversation about rights or my slides about rights really focus a little bit on the situation in the US and then the situation in Canada and Ontario. And thankfully, in 1990, we saw the US Americans with Disability Act pass the Senate and the House, US House. When you talk about individual people in positions of power and the way they look at the world actually having an impact, can you imagine if Donald Trump was currently the president of the United States in 1990? I mean, he's publicly made fun of people with different abilities. This legislation might not have been passed. It turns out that Herbert Walker Bush, the elder, was the president of the United States when this was passed, and he was a huge advocate for the US ADA. This picture here predates the US ADA. It's the 1970s. US ADA was passed in July of 1990. In March, there was a protest in Washington. And at one point, several folks led by an 8-year-old girl, Jennifer Keelan, who you see kind of in the center of the frame here, dropped their walking aids and crawled or whatever they needed to do up the steps of the Capitol building in protest, right? So, I mean, this is just like a beautiful metaphor for what needed to change. In Canada and Ontario, I wanted to, well, I don't know if anyone knows who this guy is. This is Bill from Schoolhouse Rock. A nod to my past in the 1970s. I've always wanted to have Bill in a presentation. The story in Ontario around special education, you know, we can go back to the turn of the 20th century. 1950, we have the Hope Act. which is actually, let's see here, the Royal Commission on Education in Ontario, with great recommendations, and nothing gets done. Really nothing gets done until 1980, when we have Bill 82, which basically requires schools to get their act together, and school boards, and to open up to folks with different abilities, right? And then we have a series of other acts, human rights acts, that are happening in the early 80s. The Canadian Charter on Rights and Freedoms, Canadian Human Rights Act, the Ontario Human Rights Code, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which Canada signed on to in 2010. All of these acts have statements about equal access to education, irrespective of who you happen to be. And one of those identities that are explicitly mentioned in all of them is disability. They might say physical disability. Some of the language has changed over time, but they all kind of touch on and refer to one another. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act is probably, prior to this, there was the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, really talks about environment and a range of other things providing accessibility. And I'm getting closer to talking a little bit about our work. So what does the TDSB say? Well, the TDSB has to comply with all of these other acts and codes, right? They have to have policies in place to do that. And that involves, one of the key texts and processes is developing the individual education plan for students who are identified as having exceptionality, which is code for disability, which is code for impairment. Like, it really depends on who you're talking to. And there are all kinds of problems with the language of the documents, but that's for another day. And then there's also student transportation. So students with special needs are entitled to bus service irrespective of where they happen to be located. Okay. So I do have a couple of stories about how school transport is or is not working. So mom, and these other two anecdotes at the bottom are there just kind of to show you how absurd things can get. Like, Calgary Airport apologizes for turning disabled parking spaces into Lexus-only spots. That actually happened. East Toronto meeting on accessible housing project booked at an inaccessible venue. Then they moved to another place that was also unsuitable. Like, it's so painful, it's laughable. Mom of a disabled student left on a school bus files a $700,000 lawsuit. On Tuesday, sorry, I'm having trouble seeing here we go, let's do this. September 6th, 6-year-old Adam, who lives with autism spectrum disorder, waited anxiously for the yellow bus to arrive. However, the bus never came. Frustrated, his mother took him to school herself. Now, the Ontario Ombudsperson did this whole project called The Root of the Problem, because there was a period in 2016 where school busing completely fell apart as a service in the TDSB and TCDSB. This happened to us as well. I was waiting outside in a driving snowstorm with Asha for about 45 minutes and her bus never came. I'm a professor. I have the flexibility to take Asha to school without losing my job. That is not the case for everyone. So the mother of Beth, 6, lost her job after repeatedly showing up to work late because the bus was delayed or didn't arrive to pick up her daughter in the morning. And the other one that's just wild to me, students with special needs who were supposed to receive door-to-door transport also went missing. Like, that just seems unconscionable to me. Like, what, and what does this story look like if this isn't a student with special needs who goes missing? What kind of power gets behind turning the wheels of progress to make sure that doesn't ever happen again? And if we look at this intersectionally, this is a story, you should check this one out. Caroline Buffalo's 5-year battle with the Department of Justice over a 30-kilometer school trip. Jordan's Principle is a piece of legislation constructed in honor of Jordan Anderson, who is an Indigenous child who had several different challenging clinical diagnoses. He lived for about 5 years. And one of the problems with providing services to children on reserve is that there are multiple different organizations that provide funding for those services, and they often were fighting with each other about who's going to pay for what. So Jordan's principle, which is actually law, is about saying we're going to pay for this stuff up front and figure out who pays what part of the bill later on. So basically, this fellow, he had cerebral palsy, and he needed to go to another school, one that had adequate services to provide him with equal access to education, which is his right, his human right under charter rights, under the Canadian Human Rights Act, and so on. And no one would cover his transport costs, right? Right, so all of this is context leading to the work that we've been doing in my research group on school transport and disability in childhood. So one of the things I wanted to do is say, okay, I've been doing work on children, youth, and active travel and all this stuff for a long time. And one of the things I noticed is that, you know, even in my own work, we did this study called the BEAT Project. We didn't really intentionally look for or address the experiences of children with disability in that research, which is a problem. So I wanted to see what was going on in literature more broadly. So, and the other thing that we did was we intentionally looked to publish our work in mainstream geography or transport journals, hoping to influence the course of debate in those places, right? We have some other work that we're publishing in you know, journals like Disability Studies, so on. But so there are three here that I'll have maybe a bit of time to talk about. They're pretty straightforward. Basically, the systematic review showed us that we're, as scholars, doing a dismal job of working with disability in the active school transport and the children's independent mobility literature. You know, we did a systematic review and so on, like it was quite rigorous. 3.5% of the active school travel pieces that we found had something about disability. Even worse in the independent mobility. If we look at the various pillars or forms of social difference, disability is at the bottom of the chart, whether we're looking at AST or the CIM literature. And if we look intersectionally, wait a second here. We're doing a particularly bad job if we're wanting to look at things like race, ethnicity, and disability. So disability is largely unconsidered in that literature. Intersectional perspectives are lacking. Much of the literature is based in North America and Nordic countries. A lot of the subjects who participate in the work are children with cerebral palsy. So there seems to be something going on there where it's easier to access children with that clinical diagnosis than other kids. So in our work, we purposefully looked at broadening the clinical presentation among our subjects to see if you know, they had some shared challenges around mobility, but different clinical diagnoses. So in our work, we looked at kids with osteogenesis imperfecta, which is a bone wasting disease, cerebral palsy, and spinal muscular atrophy. The other thing too is oftentimes scholars are kind of using disability as a label, just like at the start of the talk, right? So, okay, who can we label as disabled in this data set, or who's identified themselves as disabled in this data set, and what's going on with them, right? So it's not really thinking about disability using informed by social theory in any particular way. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that's you know, it derives from your ontological and epistemological perspective, right? The basis for all of the other work was, and this was funded by SSHRC, you know, visional. So we piloted a process of developing photo voice tools for our children. My family was one of the pilot households. It was really interesting getting interviewed by my PhD student and tearing up during the process, because I realized people just don't ask us, you know, how, like, what's going on for us? What is this experience like? So it was this almost like this catharsis, this cathartic moment that I went through in the research process, which I completely didn't expect. So I'm not going to talk really about what photo voice is, other than to say we needed to figure out how to enable the inclusion of, you know, we had 15, I think we had 30 parent-child dyads, like pairs, and we had to figure out how to accommodate, how to enable, how to include children with different abilities in a photo voice study. Some of them were using wheelchairs, some of them were using walkers. So we worked to test different mounts and do all kinds of wonderful things with camera technology. This is actually Asha's hand. She was our first participant, and it was just awesome. She was 5 at the time, and like totally understood what we needed, and she also contributed to our thinking about what was going to work, what wasn't going to work, and very quickly identified, you can see this little carpet in the living room. So I said to her, okay, I want you to take some pictures of things that don't quite work for you in your chair. And she took a picture of the carpet. So the next day we removed the carpet, right? So when we think about intervention, it's not always about, oh, we have to build, like we have to completely change the structure of this building. There can be very small changes that can be incredibly meaningful. And, you know, I kind of knew that the carpet was a problem. It was getting bunged up in her chair. But in that moment, she expressed her agency and said, this isn't working for me. And I was like, well, you know, I have to listen to what she's saying, get this fixed. So in the process of doing that work, we learned a lot about enabling technologies, engagement, and researcher reflexivity. And these are some of the pictures that some of the students took in the pilot study. You know, I'm running out of time here, so I can't go through all of them. Each one of them probably I could talk about for 5 minutes, but one of the things they convey, when we did this work, we broke down the school trip just from home to school, but we broke that home to school trip into a number of micro environments, like inside the home, from the home to the sidewalk or driveway, from the sidewalk or driveway to the vehicle that was going to take you to and from school. And we looked at sort of where do the institutional responsibilities lie for making each of those microenvironments accessible? What is the experience of families in each one of those microenvironments? What's the experience of the children in each one of those microenvironments? This is the last one that I want to talk to, and I'm going to talk about a specific example. We're doing a lot of different writing on the basis of the data that we collected, but this particular piece I wanted to do because it reflected also our experience. And Asha was in an integrated preschool program. I used to have to physically carry her about 200 meters to the door of the school because there wasn't adequate parking. And when the school tried to accommodate, there were no signs or anything like that, so people would just park in the place that they reserved for us. There was also on-street disability parking, and nobody adhered to the signage. So we were put into quite a difficult circumstance there. So I want to talk about this particular example because it relates to rights and equal access. So one of the things that happens in school, and this is something that happens with Asha as well, is that there's this idea that we are bound by the transport schedule, right? And maybe they are, I don't know. But the point is that what this often means, or what this can mean, is that a child is taken out of the classroom. So a child with a disability in Ontario will, when they arrive at school in elementary school, they'll go to their IEP room. It's their kind of like their home room. And then they get organized by the educational assistants, and then they go off to their integrated curriculum, integrated classroom, which is in a different part of the building. So at the end of the school day, what was happening is EAs will bring the child out of the integrated classroom 10, 15 minutes, as in this example, each day, right? So all the other kids are dismissed at, so this child is leaving at 3, the others are dismissed at 3:15. What this amounts to is 47.5 hours per 190-day school year of missed classroom time, which isn't necessarily time with curriculum, it's also time with friends. So like that's absurd. And I would ask and challenge the school board to tell me in what way or how that missed time is compliant with the UN CRPD, which Canada signed on to, is compliant with charter rights, is compliant with Canadian Human Rights Act, is compliant with the Human Rights Code, Ontario Human Rights Code. It's absolutely not. In a way, it's another example of separate but equal, which is something that disability rights activists have been fighting against for decades in North America and beyond. If we flip this on its head, so say Asha's in a classroom, there's 2 kids out of 25 who have individual education plans. What if the other 23 kids are missing 47.5 hours of classroom time every year? There would be a riot, right? I mean, it just wouldn't happen. So why is it happening in this particular case? So when we have our meetings with the school, we're advocating for change in that particular thing. Okay. You know, this is really a quick talk through a lot of heavy stuff. And I think I'm out of time. There are other things I wanted to talk about. I would be happy to do so offline at any time. You can see where to reach me there. There's my email contact. And I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the work of our participants, not only in their everyday lives, but also in their choice to actively participate in our research. It's a different universe, school travel and the work and the care work and so on that goes into all of this when you have a child with disability. And so, you know, these families are working at the margin of their energy reserves. So participating was, you know, just above and beyond the call. And I also I wanted to acknowledge Shirk, because the Insight Development Program actually worked for me. It allowed me to completely change course in my research program, change for the better, I think, without turning back. So I'm thrilled to have been funded by them and to have been able to do this work. And I thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Ron. This was like really good and moving to see the thing. I've known that you have been working in this area for a while, but I like to see all the pieces together and understand more and better. And I'd like to praise you that you're trying to get the word into transportation research part A and transport reviews, not going in the specialized, trying to make it more a broader discussion. That's something great. I'll start by reading a question. The students have been like politicized from the previous talk, so they go to politics a lot. So we'll go to a political question. Why do you think is the principal limitations in Canada to have something like the ADA? What's stopping us from reaching like a good Canadian with Disability Act? And when I said this in a meeting a couple of months ago in Toronto, when we used to be able to travel, someone was like, no, we are really doing very well in Ontario. So is it true? Is the provinces doing a good job? In Montreal, in Quebec, I can tell you we're not doing that a good job.
So there are a couple questions there. So we have the Accessible Canada Act, which is kind of like, in a way, it's sort of our version of ADA, but you know, you ask yourself a question. We often like to think of ourselves as being a nation that's more progressive than our friends to the south, but why is it taking us so much longer to get something that's labeled as being about disability? But the Accessible Canada Act doesn't have disability in the title of the act, which is maybe, I hadn't really thought about this until this question. I think that might be a problem. The other thing too is disability is buried in all of these other, in things like charter rights and the Human Rights Code. other acts. And so what the US ADA does was, or has been done by, to a certain degree, the existing acts in the charter, right? Except for environmental stuff. So like, for example, we have AOTA, which is basically saying like we have to get our act together in the public-private realm around making places accessible, not just places, but removing barriers that are institutional, attitudinal. That's what something that people forget is AOTA is not just about the physical environment. It's also about changing attitudes and removing discriminatory practices. I don't think we're doing, like, this is like Doug Ford saying racism doesn't exist in Ontario. It's patently absurd. Ableism is alive and well in Ontario. I can give you another example. So like my kids are home. Today has been absolutely wild in my house. My kids are still home because we've chosen not to put them in-person school because of Asha's health risks, right? The TDSB is supposed to, education in Ontario is a provincial responsibility. It's a provincial responsibility across the country. TDSB was supposed to launch the online school last week, and they wrote us 2 days before the start to say it's going to be delayed a week. So they started in-person classes a week before they're starting the virtual classes, right? So you kind of have like a weird, so I started to think about charter rights. Is this like, this is not equal access, right? Because a lot of the families who are deciding to keep their kids home are doing so because of health and welfare reasons, right? So that's a problem. So I don't see like any sort of accessibility utopia in Ontario.
Okay. So you
Yeah.
don't see like, because when I said this, they jumped on me saying like, oh no. Okay. So let me go to more transport specific questions by Cole Gleason. So we are trying to enable walkability and trying to get rid of cars and trying to make our space less inviting for the cars. But we know that for people with disability, for paratransit to reach and for cars to reach for people with disability. So how can you balance things from your point of view? Also, are we like increasing the disability by not allowing the cars to reach some of these areas that we're trying to make it attractive to everyone?
Yeah, so this is something that I became a little bit frustrated with in the active school travel world, because there's a lot of focus on getting rid of automobility. Like we want to have a car-free zone around a school, and then I'd say, oh yeah, but what about a bus that has children labeled as exceptional by the school board? What about my daughter's access to the school site? And then people will be like, oh yeah, we're going to take care of that. No, it can't be an afterthought. It has to be forethought.
Yeah.
You know, it's fine. Okay, we're going to have a school safety zone, but we also have to plan that with disability in mind. We're going to have a bike plan, but we have to do that with disability in mind, right? You know, I've actually been kind of critical of the Toronto cycling plan because it, you know, there's all kinds of stuff that happens there, which is wonderful. But I can tell you what it's like as a parent driving a disability van trying to get Asha like access onto the sidewalk. So you have to be thinking about these things in real time from a design point of view, and you have to have community engagement from persons with disability in the city building exercise, right? And the other problem is like some people think about, and one of my limitations is my positionality. So I often gravitate towards mobility impairment because that's what our family's experience is. But if you're going to have a conversation about how to design the city, a walkable city, and include persons with disabilities, you need to also have representation of diversity and disability. It's not just about the wheelchair users. It's also about folks who have visual impairment, hearing impairment, mental health issues, and so on and so forth, and people who suffer from, people who have comorbidity, more than one of these things going on, you know. So I think part of it is the lack of adequate engagement with with disabled users, or users who are disabled by failing poorly designed infrastructure in the conversation about development.
I'll end with one last question. I know we are running over time, but there's one last question I want to end with. It's from one of the students, Julian. He's asking, are there models of cities or regions, since you travel a lot sometimes when you go to conferences? Which city there were areas that you felt that was a good, you felt that there's, or through your studies, that you felt this is a good example of home to school mobility being well accommodated for people with disability? Who is the, like we look in the south, to the south, trying to imitate the ADA, for example, as much as we can, and we think it's amazing. So what other areas do you think, or for the school travel for children, that you think are doing a good job around the world?
That's a really good question. I've been so almost myopically focused and passionately focused on what's happening here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't often dig into the policy and so on in other places. We have this review paper that we did on busing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there are some places that are doing some quite innovative work, but at the moment I can't recall. I know, like I can give you an example where Holland Bloorview Kids Rehab Hospital has an urban experience program, right? Where they work with some of their child and youth clients to work on urban navigation issues and transit issues. I can tell you, like from just sort of walking around and travel, we were in the hills of San Bernardino, California, and forget about school travel for a second. But we were at this shopping mall, and I all of a sudden realized everything was at grade. Like we parked in this interior parking area, and there were no curbs. There's no curb cut, or there was no need for curb cut because everything was at grade. You could go from your vehicle directly into a store. We got to about 5,000 feet elevation in this area called the San Bernardino Children's Forest, which probably is burned down by now because California is completely on fire. But they had paved, like, now I have some issues with this from like an environmental, like natural heritage perspective. But it was interesting to note that they had paved pathways through this environment that's at very high elevation for the express purpose of enabling an experience of the natural environment for children who might be in a wheelchair, or other wheelchair users, other users of mobility aids. So it's one of those things, and people are sending me things all the time. Like I do work on playgrounds. And every now and then a colleague who's at a meeting somewhere will send me something, an environmental, like natural heritage perspective. But it was interesting to note that they had paved pathways through this environment that's at very high elevation for the express purpose of enabling an experience of the natural environment for children who might be in a wheelchair, or other wheelchair users, other users of mobility aids. So it's one of those things, and people are sending me things all the time. Like I do work on playgrounds, and every now and then a colleague who's at a meeting somewhere will send me something. So I had some colleagues who were in where were they? Oh, somewhere in South America. I can't remember which city they were in. And they sent me, we think we're doing such a good job. We're doing all of this innovative. It's already happened somewhere else. So we have to be careful in patting ourselves on the back, I think. Yeah.
Great. We are like 5 minutes, 6 minutes after. So thank you so much, Ron. Thanks for giving us the time. This was like a great talk, and we're really happy to see you. I'm really happy personally to see you. I haven't seen you for conferences for a long time, so it's good to see you again. And hopefully we'll bring you back for the students to talk to them and to open to the public. Thank you so much.
I'd be happy to chat with folks at any time. So I'm accessible. Yes. Okay. Thanks very much.
I appreciate having you on. It's always great to see you. Thanks.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.